It was late July 1944, just south of Saint-Lô. A German anti-tank crew waited in the heavy shadow of a dirt embankment. The Parquet 40 was designed for exactly this kind of predatory warfare, standing less than 5 feet tall and firing a propellant charge. The American forces had thrown a vast, invisible net over the sector. The moment the German crew pulled their lanyard, they tripped a wire in that net. The officer in the ditch pressed the transmit button on his handset and spoke a string of numbers into the static. But spotting the gun and reading a map coordinate was only the first step. The transmission meant nothing if the heavy guns could not react fast enough. The German anti-tank crew was highly trained. If they suspected they had been discovered, or if they felt the battle turning against them, they could attach their weapon to a tractor and fall back to the boat. Next, defensive line. Their survival now depended entirely on speed. The question was no longer about armor penetration. It was about how fast the Americans could turn a panicked voice on a radio into a physical explosion miles away. Miles behind the burning Sherman, the radio signal from the ditch arrived in a canvas tent hidden deep in the rear. This was the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. Inside, the environment did not resemble a battlefield. It looked like an accounting office. Men in helmets hunched over folding wooden tables covered in topographical maps, acetate overlays, and slide rules that produced minimal smoke. It was exceptionally difficult to spot. The math of the ambush was simple. When the forward observer's voice crackled through the speaker, broadcasting the alphanumeric grid of the suspected Pack 40, the FDC went to work. The German crew in the hedgerow believed they were fighting the tanks in front of them. In reality, they were now fighting the men with the pencils. The task inside the tent was to translate a flat map coordinate into complex physical geometry. The American heavy guns were miles away from the target, and each battery sat in a different location. To hit the German position blind, the FDC had to calculate a customized trajectory for every single cannon. A fire direction officer immediately pinned the target's grid coordinate on a large plotting board. He measured the exact distance and compass angle from the known location of the artillery batteries to the hedgerow. But raw distance was not enough to guarantee a lethal strike. The men at the tables consulted graphical firing tables. They had to account for environmental friction. They calculated the current air temperature, barometric pressure, and wind speed at various altitudes. They factored in the exact weight of the artillery shells and the specific manufacturing lot of the gunpowder. They even adjusted the math to account for the minute wear on the steel, rifling inside the howitzer barrels. Doing this manually for a single weapon takes time. They held a concealed position. Their weapon could easily pierce the enemy armor, and they had just established a lethal choke point. The men in the FDC did it for entire battalions in less than 3 minutes. This was the true mechanical heart of the American artillery system. In other armies, an artillery battery often calculated its own firing data and fought its own isolated battles. The American FDC acted as a centralized brain. Because all the batteries in a division were linked to this single tent by miles of copper telephone wire, the FDC could instantly mass the firepower of multiple units onto a single point. The officer in charge determined that a dug-in Parquet 40 blocking an armored advance required a heavy, immediate response. Instead of assigning a single battery of 4 guns, he assigned 3 full battalions. 36 artillery pieces, scattered across different fields miles apart, were suddenly united by a single set of mathematics. The calculated numbers deflection, elevation, and powder charge were shouted down the field telephones to the gun pits. Miles away, artillery crews rapidly cranked the steel handwheels of their 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers, dialing in the exact angles. They cut the powder bags, slammed the heavy shells into the breeches, and waited for the order to pull the lanyards. The math was solved, the guns were laid, but the FDC faced one final, critical problem. Now, they expected the standard reaction. The remaining American tanks should either panic and reverse, or blindly charge forward into the kill zone. If they simply ordered all 36 guns to fire at the exact same moment, the shells from the batteries positioned closer to the front line would arrive first. A single, early explosion would act as a fatal alarm bell. The veteran German crew would instantly recognize that their position had been registered. They would abandon their camouflage, dive into their deep trenches, or hitch the gun to a tractor and retreat into the dense French countryside before the rest of the barrage arrived. To permanently delete the ambush position, the American system had to ensure the target received absolutely zero warning. To do that, the men in the canvas tent had to manipulate time. To eliminate the German Pak 40 crew before they could react, the Fire Direction Center employed a technique known as time on target. The concept was brutal in its mathematical simplicity. Instead of ordering the batteries to fire at the exact same moment, the FDC ordered their shells to land at the exact same second. Because the American artillery battalions were scattered across different fields, miles apart, their projectiles required drastically different flight times to reach the specific hedgerow. A heavy 155mm battery 5 miles to the rear might have a shell flight time of 46 seconds. A lighter 105mm battery positioned just 2 miles behind the front line might only need 19 seconds. The accompanying infantry should start firing wildly into the tree line, trying to locate the source of the ambush. Instead, something deeply unsettling happened. The men in the canvas tent calculated a universal impact time, for example, precisely 1,400 hours and 0 seconds. This single directive was pushed out across the copper wire network to the individual gun lines. In the scattered pits, the artillery officers stared at synchronized stopwatches. They did not communicate with each other, they simply watched the sweeping second hands. At exactly 46 seconds before the hour, the furthest heavy guns fired. The earth shook as they sent their massive steel casings tearing upward into the stratosphere on a high, looping trajectory. 27 seconds later, the closer batteries pulled their lanyards, launching their lighter shells on a shallower, much faster arc. High above the French countryside, dozens of artillery shells converged. They were traveling at different velocities, along entirely different parabolic curves, but they were all racing toward the identical point in time and space. Back at the ambush site, the German crew sat in their dirt trench beside the Pak 40. 6 minutes had passed since they destroyed the lead Sherman. The heavy foliage was still undisturbed. The valley remained dead quiet. Normally, if enemy artillery was searching for a position, the defenders would expect a ranging shot, a single shell landing 50 or 100 meters away. That initial blast was the universal alarm, providing a crucial 30-second window to abandon the gun and sprint for the deepest dugouts. The American column did not return fire. They did not blindly saturate the hedges with heavy machine guns. But the time-on-target barrage offered no ranging shot. Furthermore, the incoming shells were traveling faster than the speed of sound. The German gunners heard no distant thud of artillery and no warning whistle ripping through the air above them. The first indication they had been targeted was a localized apocalypse. 36 high-explosive shells, totaling thousands of pounds of steel and TNT, detonated across the small patch of dirt and clover in the exact same instant. The concussive wave was absolute. The deep trenches that the German crew relied on for survival became completely meaningless. The sheer volume of simultaneous overpressure and razor-sharp fragmentation swept through the dugout, crushing the soil and shredding the camouflage netting. The blast flipped the heavy steel carriage of the Parquet 40, shattering its optics and burying its long barrel in the mud. The perfectly executed ambush position was erased in a fraction of a second. The time-on-target strike proved that if the American communications network could pinpoint a threat, it could mathematically delete it. The system was highly efficient at turning flat map coordinates into shattered steel, but this machinery relied entirely on the curved, plunging trajectory of field howitzers. What happened when? The German defenders recognized this pattern and adapted. What happened when they pulled their premier anti-tank guns? The trailing Shermans simply dropped smoke canisters, threw their transmissions into reverse, and backed slowly out of sight down the narrow farm road, back into hardened concrete bunkers, or dug them into the steep reverse slopes of ridges where parabolic artillery shells could not physically reach them. When the German army realized that exposing a position meant instant death by synchronized artillery, they changed the geometry of their defense. They stopped placing the Parquet 40 inches flat hedgerows. Instead, they dragged the heavy guns onto reverse slopes, the backside of hills, or tucked them deep into narrow stone ravines, and reinforced concrete pillboxes. This was a direct countermeasure to the American Fire Direction Center. Field artillery relies on a parabolic curve. A howitzer shell fired from 5 miles away must drop down onto its target. If an anti-tank gun is dug into the steep backside of a ridge, the incoming artillery will either impact harmlessly on the forward crest or sail completely over the valley. For a brief period, this adaptation worked. A German crew hidden on a reverse slope could destroy an American tank as it crested the hill. The infantry observer in the ditch would grab his radio and transmit the coordinates. The FDC would plot the math, only to realize the terrain completely masked the target. The heavy guns could not reach it. The German crew, hearing no incoming barrage, believed they had successfully found the blind spot in the American machine. But the American communications network possessed a second, deadlier layer. The radios carried by the infantry disappeared into the drainage ditches. The valley fell entirely silent. Not a single tank round was fired in retaliation. The infantry and mounted-in-command tanks did not just connect to canvas tents in the rear. They broadcast upward. Loitering thousands of feet above the battlefield were squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons. The Allied air forces had developed a roaming system of close air support. Instead of strictly flying pre-planned bombing missions against factories or rail yards, these heavily armed fighter bombers flew on station over the front lines, waiting in the sky, listening for a radio call from the ground. When the artillery could not reach the reverse slope, the American ground commander switched frequencies. He spoke directly to an air liaison officer, or sometimes straight to the pilots circling above. To bridge the gap between the men in the mud and the aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour, the ground troops needed a visual marker. A surviving Sherman tank or a frontline mortar team would fire a single white phosphorus shell at the crest of the hill directly above the concealed Parquet 40. From the ground, the German crew saw a sudden bloom of brilliant white smoke just above their position. A few seconds later, they heard the deep, thundering roar of a massive radial engine. A P-47 Thunderbolt would roll over on its wing, align itself with the white smoke, and enter a steep, screaming dive. From the air, the reverse slope offered. For exactly 6 minutes, the German crew sat in perfect quiet. The gun commander scanned the empty road through his binoculars. Zero protection. The open firing slit of a bunker or the deep trench of a hedgerow was completely exposed to an attack from above. The aircraft did not rely on plunging artillery shells. It unleashed 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. Powered by solid fuel, these rockets flew in a flat, blindingly fast trajectory, each carrying a 50-pound explosive warhead. Following the rockets came the concentrated fire of 8.50 caliber heavy machine guns, chewing through the dirt, the steel splinter shield, and the men huddled behind it. In a matter of seconds, the Thunderbolt would pull out of its dive, leaving the heavy anti-tank gun in burning ruins. The blind spot had been decisively closed. By combining the synchronized artillery barrages with immediate fighter-bomber strikes, the American forces had built a system that could delete nearly any obstacle on the map from any angle. But neutralizing a single gun was only a tactical event. What happens to an entire German defensive front when its premier armor killers are systematically erased from a distance, long before the main American armored assault even begins? The destruction of one PK-40 on a hillside was a localized violent event. But multiply that exact sequence across a 20-mile front, and the true scale of the American advantage becomes clear. A standard German infantry division defending a sector in Normandy or the Siegfried Line, they had not been spotted. They had suffered no casualties. Their camouflage netting remained unbroken. By all traditional tactical logic, relied on a carefully positioned network of towed anti-tank guns. These weapons were the load-bearing pillars of the entire defensive line. The German command knew they could not match Allied tank production. Their operational strategy was to inflict such catastrophic losses on the American armored spearheads that the offensive would eventually grind to a halt from sheer exhaustion and a lack of replacement vehicles. The American communications network turned that strategy into a death spiral. Because the fire direction centers and fighter bombers could erase targets so quickly, the rhythm of the battlefield fundamentally changed. Instead of a week-long, muddy infantry slog to clear a single fortified crossroads, the timeline compressed. A lead Sherman was knocked out. A forward observer keyed his handset. 3 minutes later, a time-on-target barrage vaporized the German gun. 10 minutes after that, a heavy recovery vehicle arrived to shove the burning American chassis off the dirt road. The armored column throttled up, shifted gears, and rolled forward again. To hold the sector, a German battalion commander desperately needed to replace the lost gun. But the logistical reality of late 1944 made this nearly impossible. Moving a ton-and-a-half weapon required a prime mover, usually a half-track or a team of heavy draft horses. Moving on the roads during daylight invited immediate strafing from roaming aircraft, surrounded by the smell of damp soil and crushed clover. Their weapon was the PK-40, a 7.5mm anti-tank gun dug so deeply into the brush. They had successfully locked down the route and halted an armored breakthrough. Then, the sky ripped open. If a crew attempted to drag a reserve gun into position under the cover of darkness, they often found that the American advance had already bypassed their new coordinates. Once the heavy anti-tank screen was shattered, the entire front collapsed. The German infantrymen in the trenches, armed mostly with bolt-action rifles and machine guns, were suddenly left naked against the armor. They could not hold a village or a tree line without the heavy guns to protect them. With the PK-40s erased, the true design of the American armored force was finally unleashed. The Sherman tank was never meant to sit in a narrow farm lane and trade armor-piercing shells with camouflaged snipers. It was built for mechanical reliability, speed, and deep exploitation. Freed from the immediate threat of concealed high-velocity guns, the American tanks accelerated. They bypassed the pinned-down infantry, severed telephone wires, and overran the supply convoys, desperately trying to retreat to the next river line. The tactical victory of destroying one-point tank had purchased the German defenders barely 15 minutes of delay. In exchange, they lost the only weapon capable of stopping the next 50 tanks, pouring through the gap. The German army was not being defeated in tank-on-tank combat. Its defensive architecture was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. There was no warning whistle. There was no single ranging shot to adjust the aim, without a single American tank ever pointing its gun, by an invisible network of radios, maps, and mathematics. This massive machinery dictated the pace of the campaign across Western Europe, but at the very tip of the spear, where the steel actually met the hedgerow, the entire system relied on a brutal human catalyst to function. To understand the true cost of this operational dominance, we have to look at the men who were forced to trigger the trap. The German gunner near Saint-Lô, staring through his optics at the smoking Sherman, believed he was the apex predator of the hedgerows. He had followed his training perfectly. He stayed hidden. He waited for the lethal range. He killed the armor. But the question in Normandy was never really about armor penetration, muzzle velocity, or the thickness of steel plating. It was about whether an isolated weapon could survive an encounter with an integrated machine. The German crew thought they were fighting 5 men in a 30-ton tank. In reality, they were fighting a radio operator pinned in the ditch, a fire direction officer staring at a plotting board miles to the rear, 36 howitzer crews waiting by their breeches, and a fighter pilot circling in the cold air thousands of feet above. The Sherman tank, despite its size and its main gun, was not the primary killing instrument of the American offensive. It was the bait. At the hedgerow, an avalanche of high explosives detonated directly on top of the German position. The ground erupted in a synchronized wave. This was the quiet, brutal reality understood by every American armored crew leading a column through the French countryside. For the vast, destructive machinery of the artillery network to function, it needed a precise target, and in the dense, restrictive terrain of Western Europe, the only reliable way to find a perfectly camouflaged Pak-40 was to drive down a narrow road and wait to be hit. The tanks were armored probes, sent forward to trigger the trap so the invisible system could identify the threat and erase it. When the synchronized time-on-target barrage finally lifted from that dirt road in July 1944, the silence that followed was entirely different from the quiet of the ambush. The valley had been physically reshaped. The German anti-tank position was a tangled wreck of fractured steel and splintered wood, its crew buried beneath the collapsed embankment. They had lost the sector not because they were untrained or cowardly, but because their doctrine belonged to a war of isolated, direct-fire duels. They had brought a sniper rifle to a war of mathematics. A few hundred meters down the lane, the lead Sherman sat dead on its tracks. Black smoke drifted through the shattered branches above it, and oil pooled in the dirt beneath its perforated hull. Of 105 mm and 155 mm artillery shells. The Pak-40 was flipped into the air. The trench collapsed. Within minutes, a heavy armored recovery vehicle would rumble forward to drag the wreckage off the path. The surviving tanks would throttle up, shift into gear, and roll past the destruction. The operational breakthrough would continue exactly as the system designed. The network of copper wire, radio frequencies, and calculated geometry systematically dismantled the German defensive lines across Western Europe. But the system itself was invisible. It only existed because of the people forced to operate it under fire. It relied on the forward observer, pressing his face into the wet clover, reading a map coordinate while tracer fire snapped through the brush over his helmet. It relied on the artillerymen miles away, deafened by the constant concussion of their own weapons, hauling heavy bags of gunpowder in the summer heat. It relied on the German gunner, who held his nerve and did exactly what his manuals demanded. only to be obliterated by an enemy he never saw. And at the center of the equation, it required the point driver, a young man sitting in the steel belly of the lead tank, resting his hands on the steering levers. He shifted the heavy transmission into gear, stared through a narrow block of thick glass, and drove slowly into the dark, silent tree line, simply waiting for the flash. The perfectly executed ambush was erased from the map in less than 30 seconds. The German crew had executed their job flawlessly. They fired accurately, maintained their concealment, and neutralized the immediate armored threat. Yet, winning that local firefight directly triggered their own immediate destruction from an enemy they could not even see. To understand how a concealed anti-tank position could be annihilated without a single tank returning fire, we first have to look at the doctrine the German crew trusted to keep them alive. The spine of the German defensive line in 1944 was not the heavy tank. It was a sprawling network of towed artillery anchored by the PK-40. Weighing nearly 1.5 tons, the 7.5mm Panzerabwehrkanone was a low-slung, heavily engineered piece of steel that its long barrel was practically invisible at 50 paces. The crew had done this before. They knew the violent rhythm of armored warfare. It was not a weapon designed for maneuver warfare. It required a heavy tractor or a half-track to move, and hooking it up under fire was nearly impossible. Once a crew dragged it into a Norman hedgerow, dug a deep trench for its split trails, and draped its long barrel in local foliage, it was locked in place. Because they could not easily run away, German anti-tank crews had to become snipers. By this stage of the war, German doctrine relied on a cold, calculated equation. They could not match Allied tank production, so they countered with concealment. A well-hidden, relatively inexpensive gun could reliably destroy a 30-ton mechanical beast, provided the crew maintained absolute discipline. They were taught to dig deep, mask their steel splinter shields with mud and branches, and wait until the enemy armor crossed into a pre-registered kill zone. The logic of this doctrine had been proven on the Eastern Front. When a Soviet armored spearhead hit a concealed anti-tank screen, the resulting battle was usually a direct, line-of-sight brawl. The tanks would halt, rotate their turrets, and try to blast the guns out of the tree line with high explosives. It was a contest of armor thickness against muzzle velocity. If the German gunner was accurate, and if his position was camouflaged well enough to survive the initial return fire, he controlled the sector. They stayed perfectly still, waiting until the grinding squeal of steel tracks grew loud enough to vibrate the dirt under their boots. The crew near Saint-Lô applied this exact logic. They trusted the sheer kinetic energy of their armor-piercing shells. They trusted their smokeless propellant, which minimized the visual signature of their weapon after firing. They believed that if they remained invisible and struck the hardest target first, the enemy advance would shatter. When the lead Sherman burned, the German crew assumed the battle would follow the old rules. The surviving American tanks would either retreat or attempt to engage the hedgerow directly. The accompanying infantry would be forced to crawl through the mud, blind and unsupported, trying to root out the gun with rifles and grenades. It would be a slow, grinding infantry fight, exactly the kind of tactical delay the German army desperately needed to stabilize the front. Their confidence was entirely rational. They understood ballistics. They understood armor penetration. They knew how to camouflage a 1.5-ton machine so perfectly that it vanished into the European landscape. But their doctrine contained a fatal blind spot. It assumed a linear relationship between the visible threat and the tactical response. In the minds of the PaK-40 crew, the Sherman tank bleeding black smoke on the dirt road was the ultimate predator of the battlefield. They believed that by killing the armor, they had broken the weapon. They did not realize that the American military in 1944 was operating under a completely different set of rules. At a measured distance of 350 meters, the lead American Sherman tank broke the tree line. The German gunner did not hesitate. To understand why the German calculation failed so catastrophically, we have to look at what the Americans were actually doing on those narrow roads and the brutal price they paid before the hidden machinery of their response could engage. To understand why American tanks were consistently caught in these ambushes, you have to look at the physical geometry of the battlefield. In the summer of 1944, the terrain of northern France was a fortress of ancient roots, dense earth, and sunken farm lanes. The landscape physically restricted armored movement to dirt paths barely wide enough for a single vehicle. There was no room for the sweeping, flanking maneuvers that pre-war doctrine had imagined. To advance, someone had to drive first. That dangerous job fell to the point tank. Usually, this was a single 30-ton Sherman tasked with feeling its way blindly through a landscape designed for defense. The reality of driving a buttoned-up tank into hostile territory was defined by sensory deprivation. The driver navigated by looking through a narrow block of thick glass. The turret crew breathed cordite fumes and listened to the deafening mechanical drone of the engine, which effectively masked the sound of anything outside the steel hull. To get any real sense of the battlefield, the tank commander often had to stand. The heavy steel block of the breech slid shut with a sharp, oily click. He fired. An armor-piercing shell left the muzzle at nearly 800 meters per second, with his head and shoulders exposed from the top hatch, scanning the tree line while completely vulnerable to sniper fire. This geography handed the German defenders a massive advantage. A PaK-40 crew did not need to maneuver or hunt. They simply found a choke point where the road curved or narrowed, dug their weapon into the embankment, covered it with local foliage, and waited. Because the American tank had no choice but to drive directly into the crosshairs, the German gunner always held the initiative. The cost of this dynamic was brutal. American armored spearheads were bleeding vehicles at an alarming rate. The first indication that a sector was defended was usually the fatal metallic crack of a high-velocity shell striking steel. When the lead Sherman was destroyed, the entire column was immediately paralyzed. The burning chassis became a permanent roadblock in the narrow lane. The trailing tanks could not easily reverse or turn around. Infantrymen walking alongside the armor were suddenly forced to dive into the drainage ditches, pinned down by secondary machine gun fire. A single, well-placed PaK-40 crew could stall a multi-battalion advance for hours, forcing American commanders to slowly untangle a lethal traffic jam. If the US Army tried to fight these ambushes by the old rules, the impact was immediate. The Sherman lurched to a violent halt, a fatal hole punched cleanly through its front armor plate. They would lose the campaign of attrition. They could not afford to trade one Sherman for every hidden anti-tank gun between the beaches and the German border. If the surviving tanks tried to engage the hedgerow directly, swiveling their turrets to fire high explosives blindly into the brush they sows, played exactly into the German doctrine. The PaK-40 was a small, low-profile target, protected by a deep trench and a sloped splinter shield. The tank was a massive, loud, highly visible box. In a direct line-of-sight duel, the concealed gunner could usually reload and fire a second or third time before the American tank crew could even find the source of the muzzle flash. The Americans quickly realized that using armor to duel concealed anti-tank guns was a tactical dead end. The tank was too valuable and too blind to solve the problem alone. They needed to break the German sniper's equation entirely. If the German strategy relied on a direct fight between the gun and the tank, the American answer was to refuse that fight. But how do you neutralize a weapon that only reveals itself by killing your lead vehicle? The answer lay not in thicker armor or bigger tank guns, but in a piece of equipment carried on the back of an infantryman walking in the mud. When the lead Sherman absorbed the fatal impact of the 7.5mm shell, the most dangerous man on the battlefield was not the surviving tank commander. Smoke jetted from the open hatches as the surviving American crew bailed out into the roadside ditch. It was a junior officer lying face down in the roadside ditch, covered in the dust of the explosion. He was an artillery forward observer, and strapped to the back of the radio man beside him was a 35-pound metal box that would fundamentally change how the war was fought. This was the SCR-300, a portable, battery-powered FM radio. To the German gun crew peering through their sights, it was just another piece of infantry equipment. In reality, it was the sensory nerve ending of a sprawling, industrial-scale weapon system. The American military had realized that if they could not out-armor the concealed anti-tank guns, they had to out-communicate them. They attached artillery officers directly to the armored columns and infantry platoons. These men walked in the mud with the vanguard. They took the same incoming fire and watched the same tanks burn. But their job was not to fight back with a rifle. Their job was to watch, calculate, and speak. When the ambush erupted, the forward observer did not look for a target to shoot. He looked for anomalies in the landscape. A Pak-40 used relatively smokeless powder, but the violent blast of its muzzle brake still interacted with the environment. The observer looked for a sudden tremor in the heavy foliage, a brief cloud of disturbed, dry earth. According to every rule of tank combat, the German crew had learned on the Eastern Front they had just won the engagement, or the faint, optical heat shimmer distorting the air above a specific patch of hedgerow. Once he identified the origin of the kill, the observer went to work. He did not need to see the steel of the gun itself. He only needed its mathematical address. Unfolding a topographical map, he cross-referenced his own position, using a compass and prominent landmarks: a ruined farmhouse, a stone bridge, a distant church spire. Within seconds, he translated the visual geography of a French farm lane into a precise alphanumeric grid coordinate. The German Pak-40 crew believed they were fighting the armor in front of them. They did not realize the American tank was rapidly becoming something else entirely, a 30-ton armored probe used to locate concealed defenses. By destroying the Sherman, the German gunners had inadvertently announced their exact location to the radio operator in the ditch. This ground-level observation was reinforced from the sky. Loitering thousands of feet above the battlefield were slow, unarmed Piper Cub aircraft, known as L-4 Grasshoppers. These light observation planes carried no weapons, but they carried long-range communication gear. An airborne observer looking down could often spot the flash of a Pak-40 or the deep trench lines behind the embankment that the ground troops could not see. Between the forward observer in the mud and the pilot in the clouds,